Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell. Chapter 4. The Aleuts left on a sunless day. Out of the north, deep waves rolled down upon the island. They broke against the rocks and roared into the caves, sending up white sprays of water. Before night, a storm would certainly strike. Not long after dawn, the Aleuts took down their skin tents and carried them to the beach. Captain Orloff had not paid my father for the otter he had killed. So when the news came that the hunters had packed their tents, all of our tribe left the village and hurried towards Coral Cove. The men with their weapons went first, and the women followed. The men took the trail that led to the beach, but the women hid themselves among the brush on the cliff. Ulape and I gathered far out on the ledge where I was hidden before when the hunters first came. The tide was low, and the rocks in the narrow beach were scattered with bundles of otter pelts. Half of the hunters were on the ship. The rest were wading into the water, tossing the pelts onto a boat. The Aleuts laughed while they worked, as if they were happy to leave the island. My father was talking to Captain Orloff. I could not hear their words because the noise of the hunters made, but from the way my father shook his head, I knew he was not pleased. "He is angry," Ulape whispered. "Not yet," I said. "When he's really angry, he pulls his ear." The men who were working at the canoe had stopped and were watching my father and Captain Orloff. The other men of our tribe stood at the foot of the trail. The boat went off the ship filled with otter. As it reached the ship, Captain Orloff raised his hand and gave a signal. When the boat came back, it held a black chest, which 2 of the hunters carried to the beach. Captain Orloff raised the lid and pulled out several necklaces. There was a little light in the sky, yet the beads sparkled when he turned them this way and that. Besides me, Ulape drew in her breath in excitement, and I could hear cries of delight from the women hidden in the brush. But the cries suddenly ceased as my father shook his head and turned his back to the chest. The Aleuts stood silent. Our men left their places at the foot of the trail and moved towards the few steps, waiting, watching my father. "1 string of beads for 1 pelt otter is not our bargain," my father said. "1 string and 1 iron spearhead," said Captain Orloff, lifting 2 fingers. "The chest does not hold that much," my father answered. "There is more chests on the ship," said the Russian. "Then bring them to the shore," said my father. "You have 105 bales of otter on that ship. There are 15 here on the cove. You need 3 more chests of this size." Captain Orloff said something to his Aleuts, and that I could not understand, but its meaning was soon clear. There were many hunters in the cove, and as soon as he spoke, they began to carry the otter pelts to the boat. Besides me, Ulape was scarcely breathing. "Do you think that he will give us the other chests?" she whispered. "I do not trust him. When he gets the pelts to the ship, he may leave." "It is possible." The hunters had to pass my father to reach the boat, and when the first one approached him, he stepped in his path. "The rest of the pelts must stay here," he said, facing Captain Orloff, "until the chests are brought." The Russian drew himself up stiffly and pointed to the clouds that were billowing towards the island. "I load the ship before the storm arrives," he said. "Give us the other chests, and I will help you with our canoes," my father replied. Captain Orloff was silent. His gaze moved slowly around the cove. He looked at our men standing on the edge of the rock a dozen paces away. He looked towards the cliff and back to my father. Then he spoke to his Aleuts. I do not know what happened first, whether it was my father who raised his hand against a hunter whose path he had barred, or whether it was this man who stepped forward with his bale of pelts on his back and shoved my father aside. It all happened so quickly that I could not tell one act from another. But as I jumped to my feet and Ulape screamed and other cries sounded along the cliffs, I saw a figure lying on the rocks. It was my father, and blood was on his face. Slowly, he got to his feet. With their spears raised, our men rushed down towards the ledge. A puff of white smoke came from the deck of the ship. A loud noise echoed against the cliff. 5 of our warriors fell and lay quiet. Eulape screamed again and flung a rock into the cove. It fell harmlessly beside Captain Orloff. Rocks showered into the cove from many places along the cliff, striking several of the hunters. When our warriors rushed in upon them, and it was hard to tell one from another. Eulape and I stood on the cliff and watched helplessly, afraid to use rocks that we held, lest we injure our own men. The Aleuts had dropped the bales of otter. They drew knives from their belts, and as our warriors rushed upon them, the 2 lines surged back and forth along the beach. Men fell to the sand and rose to fight again. Others fell and did not get up. My father was one of them. For a long time it seemed that we would win the battle, but Captain Orloff, who had rowed off to the ship when the battle started, returned with more Aleuts. Our warriors were forced back into the cliffs, where there were few of them left, yet they fought at the foot of the trail and would not retreat. The wind began to blow. Suddenly Captain Orloff and his Aleuts turned and ran to the boat. Our men did not pursue them. The hunters reached the ship, the red sails went up, and the ship moved slowly between the 2 rocks that guarded the cove. Once more, before it disappeared, a white puff of smoke rose from the deck. As Eulape and I ran along the cliff, a whirling sound like a great bird of flight passed over our heads. The storm struck as we ran, driving rain into our faces. Then other women were running beside us, and their cries were louder than the wind. At the bottom of the trail, we came upon our warriors. Many had fought on the beach. Few had left it, and all of these were wounded. My father lay on the beach, and the waves were already washing over him. Looking at his body, I knew he would not have told Captain Orloff his secret name. And back in our village, all of the weeping women and the sad men agreed that this had so weakened him that he had not lived through the fight and with the Aleuts and the dishonest Russian.